Some moments change everything in under 10 seconds. This was one of them. The patrol car slowed, tires crunching against the asphalt as Officer Daniel Brooks leaned out and scanned the road ahead. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet street, a calm that didn't match the tension building inside his mind. Behind the wheel, Emily Carter kept her focus on the road, her hands steady at 10 and 2, her expression calm but alert. The flashing lights appeared in her rearview mirror without warning, red and blue cutting through the stillness like a signal she had seen before. She eased onto the shoulder, following protocol, her foot resting gently on the brake as the vehicle came to a smooth stop. Brooks stepped out first, boots hitting the pavement with purpose, his hand resting near his belt as he approached. He didn't rush, but there was a certainty in his stride, the kind that suggested he believed the situation was already under his control. Emily lowered her window slowly, the warm air brushing against her face as she met his gaze with quiet composure. "Good afternoon, officer," she said evenly. He didn't return the greeting. Instead, his eyes moved over her, assessing, calculating, as if trying to place her into a category before she spoke another word. "License and registration," he said, his tone firm, clipped, leaving no room for conversation. Emily reached calmly into her glove compartment, her movements deliberate and unhurried, placing both documents in her hand before handing them over without hesitation. For a brief moment, the only sound was the faint hum of passing cars in the distance, the world continuing as if nothing unusual was happening. But Brooks lingered, his attention not on the documents, but on her. Something about his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a decision forming just beneath the surface. Emily noticed. She didn't react. Her breathing remained steady, her gaze forward, but her awareness sharpened. This wasn't her first time in a situation like this, and something in her instincts told her that this stop wasn't routine. Brooks glanced back toward his cruiser, speaking briefly into the radio, his voice low and controlled. Then he turned back, stepping closer than necessary, his presence now pressing into her space. The atmosphere shifted, the air feeling tighter, heavier, as if the moment itself was holding its breath. Emily met his eyes again, this time with a quiet intensity that didn't ask for permission. And in that instant, without a single word being spoken, something in the encounter began to change. The quiet tension from that moment did not fade as Officer Daniel Brooks continued to examine the documents in his hand, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for something that was not there. He tapped the papers once against his palm, a small gesture, but one that echoed louder than expected in the stillness of the roadside. Emily Carter remained composed inside the vehicle, her posture straight, her hands still visible on the steering wheel, her breathing controlled and even. Around them, the world moved at a normal pace, passing cars continuing their routes, drivers glancing briefly before looking away. But here, in this small space of road and light, everything felt slowed, stretched, and heavy. Brooks leaned slightly toward the window again, his voice dropping into a more deliberate tone. "Where are you coming from today?" he asked, not as a formality, but as a test. Emily turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with calm precision. "Work," she replied. Her answer was simple, direct, and consistent. But Brooks did not move on. He studied her expression longer than necessary, his silence becoming its own form of pressure. Then he glanced toward the inside of the car again, scanning the dashboard, the passenger seat, the back, as if looking for inconsistencies that could justify his growing suspicion. "Step out of the vehicle," he said after a moment, his tone no longer just procedural, but firm with expectation. Emily did not react immediately. She took a small breath, then opened the door slowly, stepping out with measured control, her movements careful, deliberate, and unhurried. The air outside felt warmer, the sunlight hitting her face as she stood upright, facing him fully now. Brooks stood slightly closer than before, his stance firm, his authority clear, but something about the way Emily carried herself began to shift the balance of the moment in ways he did not seem to notice yet. She did not look away. She did not rush to explain. Instead, she observed him just as carefully as he was observing her. A small crowd had begun to form at a distance, people slowing their steps, watching from across the street, a few raising their phones but remaining silent. The presence of others introduced a subtle layer of awareness, a quiet pressure that neither of them acknowledged directly. Brooks glanced over his shoulder briefly, noting the attention, then turned back with a slight tightening in his expression. "Do you have anything in the vehicle that I should know about?" he asked, his tone controlled, but now carrying an edge of assumption. Emily tilted her head just slightly, her eyes steady. "Everything you need to know is already in your hand," she said calmly. The words were not confrontational, but they carried weight, a quiet resistance that lingered in the air after she spoke. For a moment, Brooks said nothing. The sound of distant traffic filled the silence, but between them, the space felt suspended, like a pause before something irreversible. Emily's expression remained unchanged, but beneath that stillness was a clarity, an awareness of the situation unfolding, and a quiet readiness that had not yet been revealed. And as the seconds stretched on, something in Brooks' posture shifted again, subtle but telling, as if the certainty he arrived with was beginning to crack, even if he was not ready to admit it. Officer Daniel Brooks remained still for a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Emily Carter as if trying to recalibrate the situation in front of him. The documents in his hand felt heavier now, not physically, but in meaning, as though each second that passed was shifting the balance of control he thought he had. He glanced down at the license and registration once more, then back up at her, his expression tightening with a mixture of skepticism and impatience. Emily stood outside the vehicle now, her posture straight, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes steady and unshaken. The breeze moved lightly across the street, carrying distant sounds of traffic and everyday life. But here, between them, there was a quiet intensity that seemed to isolate the moment from everything else. Brooks took a small step closer, lowering his voice as he spoke. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, though the question carried an edge that suggested he already believed he knew the answer. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I believe you are still figuring that out yourself," she replied calmly. The response was measured, not defiant, but firm enough to disrupt the rhythm of control Brooks was trying to maintain. He exhaled slightly through his nose, shifting his weight as he looked past her toward the vehicle again, then back to her, as if searching for something in her demeanor that would justify escalation. The small group of bystanders across the street had grown slightly, more people pausing to observe, their attention focused but quiet. A few phones were now raised, recording from a distance, capturing the interaction without interruption. Brooks noticed this again, his jaw tightening briefly before he turned his attention fully back to Emily. "Step over here," he said, motioning toward the front of the patrol car. Emily followed the direction without resistance, walking a few steps forward, her movements controlled and steady. The shift in position placed them closer to the edge of the road, where the open space made the interaction feel more exposed, more visible to those watching. Brooks adjusted his stance, placing one hand near his belt, his posture firm as he continued. "You are acting very calm for someone who has been pulled over," he said, his tone now carrying a subtle challenge. Emily paused for a brief moment before responding. "Calm is usually a better choice than panic," she said, her voice even and clear. There was no rise in emotion, no change in tone, but her words lingered in the air, creating a quiet tension that Brooks seemed to notice but not fully understand. He studied her more closely now, his earlier confidence beginning to give way to something less certain, though he would not admit it. A passing car slowed slightly as it approached, then continued forward, its driver glancing toward the scene before moving on. The world kept moving, but the moment remained fixed, as if both of them were standing on opposite sides of something that was beginning to shift. Brooks looked down briefly, then back at her again, his expression harder now, but with a flicker of uncertainty beneath the surface. Emily did not look away. She held his gaze, her stillness speaking louder than any words she had used so far, and in that silent exchange, something unspoken began to take shape, something that neither of them had fully stepped into yet, but both could already feel approaching. The tension between them continued to build as Officer Daniel Brooks shifted his stance again, his patience thinning, though his voice remained controlled. The road around them carried on with its usual rhythm, but the space between Brooks and Emily Carter felt increasingly compressed, as if the moment itself was narrowing around their exchange. Emily stood in place, her posture unchanged, her attention fully on him, but with a calm awareness that extended beyond the immediate words being spoken. Brooks let out a slow breath, then gestured slightly toward the patrol car behind him. "Back up against the vehicle," he said, his tone firm, leaving no room for interpretation. Emily did not respond immediately. She held his gaze for a brief second longer, then moved as instructed, walking back toward the front of the patrol car with steady, controlled steps. Each movement was deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, but measured with precision. As she reached the vehicle, she turned to face forward, placing her hands lightly on the surface as directed, her breathing even and steady. Brooks approached from behind and slightly to the side, maintaining distance while observing her closely. His eyes scanned her posture, her expression, her every small movement, as if searching for any sign that would justify his growing suspicion. Around them, the presence of onlookers had increased, though they remained at a respectful distance. The faint sound of a phone recording could be heard, subtle but persistent, capturing each second as it unfolded. Emily remained still, but her awareness sharpened further, noticing the crowd, the environment, the shift in energy around the scene. Brooks leaned slightly forward, his voice lowering as he spoke again. "You are very calm," he said, his tone now more pointed, less procedural and more personal. Emily replied without turning her head. "Staying calm is often the most effective choice in situations like this." The response was simple, but it carried a quiet strength that seemed to challenge the assumptions forming in Brooks' mind. He straightened slightly, his expression tightening as he processed her words. For a brief moment, there was silence between them, broken only by distant traffic and the faint sounds of the city continuing beyond the intersection. Brooks reached for his radio again, speaking briefly, his tone clipped, requesting a status check. As he waited for a response, he returned his attention to Emily, watching her closely, noting that she did not react, did not shift, did not display any sign of anxiety. That lack of reaction unsettled him more than any argument might have. Emily remained in place, her hands resting steadily, her posture aligned, her presence composed in a way that did not match the expectations Brooks had formed earlier. The radio on his shoulder crackled softly, and he listened, his expression changing almost imperceptibly as he absorbed the response. He paused for a moment, then looked back at Emily again, his gaze now different, less certain than before. The dynamic between them had shifted, though neither of them spoke about it directly. The quiet around them felt heavier now, as if the situation had moved beyond its initial stage and was approaching something neither of them could fully predict. Emily finally turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his eyes again, and in that moment, the calm she carried seemed to deepen, holding steady against the tension that surrounded them, while Brooks stood facing her, aware that something about this encounter was no longer as straightforward as he had assumed. The air between them seemed to settle into a quieter rhythm, but the tension had not disappeared. It had only shifted into something more focused and deliberate. Officer Daniel Brooks stood near the patrol car, his attention now divided between Emily Carter and the subtle stream of information coming through his radio. His posture remained firm, yet there was a visible change in how he carried himself, as if the certainty he arrived with had been replaced by careful observation. Emily remained in position, her hands resting lightly against the surface of the vehicle, her stance steady, her breathing calm. She had not moved, not out of fear, but out of discipline, choosing stillness as a form of control rather than submission. Around them, the number of bystanders had grown slightly, though the crowd remained respectful and quiet. A few more phones were now raised, capturing the interaction from different angles, their screens glowing faintly in the late afternoon light. The presence of witnesses added another layer to the moment, creating a sense that what was happening here extended beyond just the two of them. Brooks glanced toward the crowd briefly, then back at Emily, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the situation more carefully. "You have been very cooperative," he said, his tone still controlled, though now carrying a more measured curiosity. Emily responded without turning fully toward him. "Cooperation does not require loss of awareness," she said calmly. The statement lingered in the air, subtle but firm, and for the first time, Brooks did not immediately respond. Instead, he paused, studying her more intently, as if trying to understand whether her composure was natural or intentional. His hand moved slightly toward his radio again, but he did not press the button. Instead, he hesitated, then lowered it, choosing to remain present in the moment. Emily finally turned her head, meeting his eyes once more, her expression unchanged but her presence more defined than before. There was no hostility in her gaze, only clarity, a quiet certainty that seemed to stand apart from the tension surrounding them. Brooks took a slow step back, creating a small but noticeable distance between them. It was a subtle shift, but one that changed the dynamic of the encounter. The control he had maintained earlier was no longer as absolute as it once appeared. A faint breeze moved through the street, carrying the sounds of distant traffic and the low hum of the city, grounding the moment in something real, something ordinary, even as the interaction itself grew more complex. Emily adjusted her stance slightly, no longer leaning against the car, now standing independently, her posture straight and composed. Brooks watched this change carefully, his expression tightening just slightly as he registered the difference. "You are not acting like someone who was just stopped," he said, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful than confrontational. Emily met his observation with a calm and steady reply. "Not every situation requires the same response," she said. The words were simple, but they carried a depth that lingered, hinting at an understanding that extended beyond the present moment. Brooks did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood there, looking at her, processing, adjusting. The encounter had moved beyond routine, beyond expectation, and into something that required more than assumption to navigate. The onlookers remained silent, watching, recording, absorbing the unfolding interaction without interfering. And in that shared silence, between a cautious officer and a composed woman, the balance of the moment continued to shift in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The moment stretched further as the quiet between Emily Carter and Officer Daniel Brooks deepened into something more deliberate, as if both of them understood that what came next would define the direction of everything that followed. Brooks stood a few feet away now, no longer pressing forward, but not retreating either. His stance had shifted into something more measured, his attention divided between Emily and the unseen weight of information he was beginning to process. His hand rested near his radio, but he did not reach for it, instead holding himself in a state of controlled restraint. Emily remained composed, her posture unchanged, but her awareness was heightened, her focus extending beyond the immediate interaction and into the environment surrounding them. The small crowd across the street had grown slightly, with more observers pausing to watch the encounter unfold. Some held their phones steady, others kept their distance, but all of them contributed to a subtle pressure that neither Emily nor Brooks could ignore. The atmosphere carried a quiet intensity, one that felt different from the earlier tension, more focused, more concentrated, as if something beneath the surface was beginning to emerge. Brooks looked at Emily again, this time with a more careful expression, his voice lowering as he spoke. "You keep saying the right things," he said, "but you are not telling me everything." Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, her tone calm. "You are asking questions that assume an answer," she replied. The words landed softly, but they carried a weight that caused Brooks to pause. He did not respond immediately, instead taking a slow breath, his eyes shifting briefly toward the surrounding area before returning to her. For a moment, the sound of distant traffic filled the space between them, a reminder that the world continued beyond this isolated moment. Brooks adjusted his stance slightly, his confidence no longer as firm as it had been earlier. The control he once projected now seemed more restrained, more cautious, as if he were aware that the situation had moved beyond a simple traffic stop. Emily noticed the shift, but she did not comment on it. Instead, she remained present, grounded, her stillness reflecting a level of control that contrasted with the uncertainty growing in the officer's expression. A faint breeze moved through the street again, carrying with it the sounds of everyday life. Yet within this small space, everything felt focused, condensed, as if the moment itself had narrowed down to a point where every word and movement carried significance. Brooks finally spoke again, his tone quieter than before. "I have seen a lot of people try to control situations. Like this," he said, his voice steady, but less forceful. You are not reacting the way I expected. Emily tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Expectations can create assumptions, she said, and assumptions can lead to misunderstanding. The response was calm, precise, and delivered without hesitation. Brooks exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he absorbed her words. The tension between them did not break, but it transformed, becoming less about confrontation and more about awareness. Around them, the bystanders continued to observe, their presence a silent witness to the shift taking place. The cameras remained steady, the focus unbroken, capturing each moment as it unfolded. And in that shared space, between a cautious officer and a composed woman who had not revealed all of her strength, the balance of control continued to move, quietly, steadily, towards something neither of them could fully define yet, but both could already sense approaching. The silence between them stretched again, but this time it carried a different weight, as if the conversation had moved from surface-level control into something deeper, something more revealing. Officer Daniel Brooks stood still, his attention fixed on Emily Carter, but his posture had subtly changed, less rigid, more measured, as though he was no longer certain that he was in full control of the situation. Emily remained steady, her stance unchanged, her presence calm but firm, her eyes holding a quiet intensity that did not seek approval or validation. Around them, the small group of observers had grown more attentive, their focus now sharper, sensing that the interaction had shifted into something more significant. The phones remained raised, capturing every detail, every pause, every subtle change in expression. Brooks exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the crowd before returning to Emily. His voice lowered, not in authority, but in something closer to curiosity. "You are not intimidated," he said, almost as if confirming a realization. Emily met his gaze directly. "Intimidation is not the same as awareness," she replied calmly. The response lingered, not confrontational, but undeniably firm. Brooks paused, his expression tightening slightly as he processed her words. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them continued as usual, but here, at the center of this encounter, everything felt suspended. Brooks adjusted his stance, crossing his arms loosely as he studied her more carefully. "Then what exactly are you aware of?" he asked, his tone quieter now, more measured than before. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she took a small breath, her eyes steady, her focus unwavering. When she spoke, her voice carried a calm confidence that seemed to settle into the space between them. "I am aware of how quickly assumptions can shape a situation," she said, "and how often they lead people to believe they are in control when they are not." Brooks said nothing in return. The statement was not aggressive, but it challenged the foundation of his earlier certainty. His jaw tightened slightly, a subtle reaction, but he remained composed, choosing to listen rather than respond immediately. The bystanders shifted slightly, some leaning forward, others adjusting their position to keep watching. The energy around them had changed, becoming more focused, more intent. Emily remained still, her hands relaxed, her posture open but controlled, showing no signs of fear, only clarity. Brooks looked at her again, his expression now more thoughtful than skeptical. "You are speaking like someone who has been in situations like this before," he said, his voice careful, observant. Emily tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "Experience teaches you how to remain present," she replied. The exchange carried a sense of balance, each word measured, each response deliberate. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, no longer pressing forward, but also not stepping away. The tension between them remained, but it had evolved, becoming something more complex than before. It was no longer just about authority or compliance. It was about understanding, about perception, about the quiet recognition that the situation was not as simple as it first appeared. The crowd remained silent, absorbing every moment, every detail. The recording devices continued to capture the unfolding scene, preserving the interaction in real time. And within that stillness, between a man who believed in structure and a woman who embodied composure, the balance continued to shift in subtle but undeniable ways, setting the stage for something that had not yet revealed itself, but was already beginning to take form. The atmosphere around the roadside had settled into a deep, almost suspended stillness, But beneath that quiet surface, something had already begun to shift. Officer Daniel Brooks stood facing Emily Carter, his earlier confidence no longer as firm, his attention more focused, more cautious than before. His eyes remained on her, but now with a level of scrutiny that suggested he was no longer certain about the assumptions he had carried into this encounter. Emily stood calmly in place, her posture unchanged, her presence steady and composed, as if she were not reacting to the tension but instead guiding it in silence. Around them, the bystanders continued to observe, their presence quiet but increasingly attentive, as if they too could sense that something significant was unfolding. The faint sounds of the city continued in the background, distant traffic and occasional movement. But here, the moment felt isolated, concentrated into a narrow space between two individuals. Brooks shifted his stance slightly, unfolding his arms as he took a slow step closer, not aggressive, but intentional. His voice was measured when he spoke. "You keep responding like this is not your first time dealing with law enforcement," he said, his tone careful, almost analytical. Emily met his gaze directly. "Experience teaches you how to stay grounded," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried a quiet strength that seemed to linger in the air after she spoke. Brooks paused, his expression tightening slightly as he considered her response. There was something in her composure that challenged the assumptions he had relied on, something that did not fit into the pattern he expected. He looked down briefly, then back up at her, as if recalibrating his approach. The crowd remained steady, a few individuals shifting their weight or adjusting their position, but none breaking the silence. The phones continued recording, capturing every second, every detail, every change in tone and posture. Brooks exhaled slowly, then spoke again, his voice softer than before. "You are not reacting like someone who feels threatened," he said. Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression calm and controlled. "Not every situation requires a reaction," she replied. The answer was not defensive, but it was firm, carrying an underlying clarity that suggested she was fully aware of everything happening around her. Brooks studied her more closely now, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in hostility, but in focused attention. The interaction had moved beyond routine questioning. It had become something else, something that required more than assumption or authority to fully understand. He glanced briefly toward his patrol car, then back at Emily, as if considering his next step. Emily remained still, her presence unchanged, but her awareness extended outward, taking in the environment, the observers. The subtle movements of the officer in front of her. There was a sense that something unseen was building, a quiet buildup of tension that had not yet reached its peak. Brooks adjusted his stance again, his posture now more balanced, less rigid than before. "I need to verify some information," he said, his tone returning slightly toward procedure. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the statement without resistance. "That is understandable," she replied. The exchange carried a sense of mutual awareness, a shift from confrontation toward observation, yet the underlying tension remained, waiting, unresolved, as both of them stood at the center of a moment that was no longer defined by control, but by the gradual unfolding of something neither of them could fully predict. The air seemed to hold its breath as Officer Daniel Brooks and Emily Carter remained facing each other, the weight of everything that had been building finally pressing into the present moment. Brooks stood a few feet away, his posture now more restrained, his earlier certainty replaced by a quiet, measured focus. His eyes moved briefly toward the surroundings, toward the bystanders who were still watching, then back to Emily, as if confirming that the moment had not slipped beyond his control entirely. Emily stood with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, but her awareness fully engaged with everything happening around her. Brooks finally spoke, his voice steady but softer than before. "We are going to verify your information," he said, maintaining a professional tone, though the shift in his demeanor was clear. Emily gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the statement without resistance. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with anticipation, as if both of them understood that the situation was approaching a point where clarity would emerge. Brooks returned to his patrol car, opening the door and stepping inside, his movements controlled but deliberate. The door closed with a soft sound that felt amplified in the quiet environment. Inside the vehicle, he reached for his radio, speaking in a low, focused tone, requesting additional verification. Outside, Emily remained in place, her hands relaxed, her posture steady, her attention still aware of everything unfolding. The bystanders remained present, their attention unwavering, some shifting slightly, others standing still, but all watching with quiet intensity. A few seconds passed, each one feeling longer than the last, as if time itself had slowed to match the weight of the moment. Brooks listened to the response through his radio, his expression shifting subtly as new information came through. His brows tightened slightly, then relaxed, as if processing something that did not align with his earlier expectations. He looked up through the windshield, his gaze finding Emily again, now with a different kind of attention, one that carried recognition and a deeper level of consideration. He remained seated for a moment longer, then opened the door and stepped back outside, closing it behind him with a steady motion. Emily remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her calm presence unwavering. Brooks approached slowly this time, no longer with the same rigid authority, but with a more measured, respectful distance. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression now more neutral, but with a hint of something deeper beneath the surface. "Your information checks out," he said, his voice clear and controlled. The words carried a different weight than anything he had said before, not because of their content alone, but because of the shift they represented. Emily gave a slight nod, her expression still composed, still steady. There was no visible reaction of surprise or triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been confirmed. Around them, the bystanders reacted subtly, some lowering their phones slightly, others continuing to record, but the energy in the space had shifted once again. The tension that had once dominated the moment was no longer as sharp, replaced by a sense of resolution that had been building gradually from the beginning. Brooks took a breath, then spoke again, his tone now carrying a level of respect that had not been present earlier. "You can go," he said. The words were simple, but they marked a clear turning point in the encounter. Emily remained still for a brief moment longer, her eyes meeting his, as if acknowledging the full arc of what had just taken place. Then, without haste, she stepped back toward her vehicle, moving with the same calm precision she had shown throughout the entire interaction. Brooks stepped aside, giving her space, his attention following her as she moved. The moment did not end abruptly, but instead settled into a quiet conclusion, one that carried the weight of everything that had unfolded. As Emily prepared to leave, the air around the scene felt different, no longer defined by tension, but by the quiet realization that what had begun as a routine stop had transformed into something far more meaningful, something that would remain in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it, long after the moment itself had passed.